Hi, everyone. We're so excited to do two things today. One, to introduce Sara to you in a one-to-many call, as well as for you to learn more about how to get press from Sara, who has very, very extensive background in this area. And as many of you know, Sara joined actually in December already, but we only announced it in January, as our new head of membership and partnerships, supporting all of us on our journeys. And we mentioned this before, but we had over 300 applications. It wasn't easy picking the right person for this role. And I hope you get to know her a lot better over the weeks and months to come and get to know why we think she's such a great fit for this role. We'll have her introduce herself to you and share a bit more on her background. First, actually, just a minute on just herself, nothing related to work, just her background, where she's from, what she's most excited about in life personally. And then we'll go over digging deep into her background so that you also know what specific questions you can ask. And then I'll go through a bit more highlight on how the format of the call will be structured. But now, let's move on to Sara and a few words on her background.
Great. Hi guys. Yeah, so it's wonderful to see all of your faces, and there's definitely a lot of names that I recognize from the Facebook groups and even from some calls. So that's a lot of fun. So my name's Sara. I grew up, I was born in Washington State. I'm half Swedish, so that's actually my first language. And that's why I've got the weird name pronunciation that drives everyone crazy. Geisha is far from the first person who has. And the terrible thing is I'm this way too. I went to college with another Sara, and I remember running into her husband years later. And the last thing I said to him before we went our separate ways after bumping into one another at the CVS in New York City was like, say hi to Sara, because I've been looking at her name so much on Facebook. So I do not get offended if you forget and call me Sara or anything like that. It's not a big deal at all. So I've lived in New York for nearly 20 years, and actually in the same building, believe it or not. I moved into a bigger apartment when I got married, but that was it. Although we are now finally looking to move to Brooklyn because we had a baby. And I think that if you've looked at any of my content that is on Dreamers and Doers, there's a lot of baby focused talk because I have a 4-month-old. And so that's sort of my universe. But it's been a lot of fun. I had a baby later in life. So I was 41 when I had him. I'm 42 now, so it's tough to do the math. And I can't recommend that part of things more highly. In terms of, it's hard actually to talk about myself without talking about my work because it's something that has been so integrated into what I do. So maybe at this point we can segue a little bit into my background. So I was a working journalist for about 15 years, just exclusively working for magazines and newspapers. And to give some context too, this was before blogging became, what it is today. I mean, blogging obviously we started seeing blogs within that time frame, but I was very much a print journalist. But then over time, I went to grad school in 2011. I went to Columbia University, had a program for health and science writers who were mid-career with a master's MA program funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So I got to go to school for free. Thank you for fellowships. And during that time, I started doing content strategy consulting for tech startups, initially in the health and health tech space, and then just sort of across the board. I've worked with everything from fashion companies to sort of more analog style startups that have an internet presence and so forth. So I've gotten to sort of see that side of the press game as a content strategist, and most recently as a strategist. And what I do is I work internally sort of at the center point of internal thought leadership, marketing, and PR to sort of think about crafting messaging and so forth. So I'm not a publicist. I don't do PR myself, but I have worked with publicists. I'm not currently a journalist or an editor, but I have been a journalist and editor for a very long time. And I've seen kind of how all of these players work together. So I can't promise that I have sort of the definitive answer to a lot of your questions, but I can certainly draw on some of the experiences that I've had. And in terms of where I was writing when I was a journalist, I'd written for the Times, the Wall Street Journal. I wrote for a lot of women's magazines like Oprah and Elle and Glamour. And then on the corporate side, some of the companies I've worked with are ZocDoc and Oscar, Ritual Vitamins, which is a newer one, Capsule Pharmacy, Further Future. I've worked with a lot of larger corporations like Condé Nast and Johnson & Johnson and Rodale. So I've seen sort of large and small, big and little, and all kinds of different contexts. So hopefully what what I can do is apply some of the things I've seen to some of the questions that you have, but definitely don't take me as the final word on anything. Just, think of this as guidance. And the nice thing is that because I'm with Dreamers and Doers, if you have follow-up questions, some of this can just be teaser for you, and you can reach out to me and ask me some personal things afterwards. So with that, maybe we'll get started.
Yes, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Also, thank you everyone for submitting questions. We'll use this as the baseline for the first part of the call before we open up to questions that you can directly ask or share via the chat. And there was a few, we kind of organized them by topics, and we want to kind of start a bit with like the pitching process and press, and we'll go a little bit about contributing as an as a contributor to platforms, as well as how to maintain the relationships with press and media, and as well as how to be very strategic about it, because we all know that can be a huge time sink. So starting out with that, when you think about, even before what you start to think about pitching, oftentimes people go directly to pitching. Starting out with, you are a company that wants exposure. Like, what are the first few steps in terms of determining that I'm currently ready for press? And what are the first few steps I should do to determine if I'm ready, and who to reach out to, and what the angle is? Because there are probably also different categories of exposure where you could be mentioned in an article, or you could have a full-fledged piece, kind of just, for lack of a better word, like a small primer on how to go about this process.
That's a really, really great question. And actually it was something that I was thinking about before this call. This is just to like give props to Geisha. This was a totally new question that we didn't have on our list. And it was awesome because I was going to try to segue one of the questions into an answer like this, which is basically that the most important thing to do first is to figure out why you think you want press. Like, what is your objective? I think that oftentimes now, because we see content everywhere, and I know that if you have a company, if you're starting a company, you're talking to potential investors or mentors, everybody's sort of talking content, and it becomes, anxiety provoking. Like, I need content, and I need to do this. I need this for my company to be successful. But to take a step back and to ask yourself why. Like, what do you want the content to do for you? And that might sort of uncover some interesting answers, because something that I've noticed, and there's three objectives that I can sort of like largely categorize things into. I mean, first of all, it's to drive sales. Like, if you have some sort of a consumer facing product to drive sales or getting new customers or whatnot. And I think, oftentimes people see these stories in the New York Times. It's, like the next Spanx, and you read about something, and then, it drives like thousands of units of sales, and suddenly they get all this investor money. But what's important to remember is that those are the unicorns. Most stories that you read in even really, really good high-end publications that have large readerships, you don't move the needle on sales all that much. It's more luck of the draw, like maybe 10%, go all the way to the top. And a lot of them are just beautiful stories that, maybe get you some traction for a little bit of time. So setting those expectations with sales, and knowing, okay, so, knowing that I don't need the big story necessarily to get sales, then what would my strategy to get sales be? Well, then you can step back and think about, well, who's my consumer? And perhaps I can target a smaller publication that speaks directly to that consumer. If I have a knitting company, for example, who are the knitting influencers? What are the knitting magazines that all the knitting people are reading? How can I really engage with those consumers? And what you might find is that you don't need a whole even piece of, written content to do that, that your content winds up being doing a podcast, doing a video call, doing something else that really touches some people and creates some super converts, some super influencers who are then actually going to go out and press the button and buy your product or engage with community in some way, versus looking at a bigger newspaper piece that somebody reads on Sunday morning in the New York Times and puts down on the breakfast table and doesn't come back and actually log onto your site. So just to recap that thing, if you're thinking about sales, you can definitely, it's always good to try for the big press, but that can take a lot of energy. And so also think about sort of what's most targeted to what you're doing. Who are the readers that you're trying, who are the consumers that you're trying to reach? The second reason why a lot of us want press is to gain credibility for a company, to connect with investors, to connect with partners, right? And so that is like a really good reason to get a press piece or two, but it's not, you don't need to get ongoing press for that. And you don't need to get much of it. I mean, if you have one valuable story in like Forbes or Fortune or something like that, you can put it on your deck. You can mention it with an investor meeting, you can mention it in a partner meeting, and then you're okay, you're good. You only need like 2 or 3 pieces like that. And the other important thing, and I hope you guys are getting this theme, which is that press should not be stressful and that you can all achieve it in some way. The other thing that you can think about with this is these don't need to be stories that are all about you or all about your company. These are stories where you can be mentioned. I mean, this is something that I love seeing on Dreamers and Doers, is when a writer posts and says, I'm writing about, X, Y, totally different topic that you might have some experience in. You're going to get a line in there that has your name and has your company. And if you're lucky, even a link to you and your company. That's really legitimate, valuable press. And that's fairly easy to get compared to engaging a publicist and sort of, reaching for the stars with all of this stuff. So you can really, it's always easier to get thought leadership press than getting press about your company, because people are always looking for individuals to give quotes in articles. So that's sort of objective number 2. And then objective number 3 is thinking about creating partnerships. And I talked a little bit about that with number 2, but really just engaging users, engaging people, that the B2B side of it, I guess is what I want to say. So ignore what I said right before, the B2B side of it. So if you're, say, I mean, this is speaking a little bit to my background, but I've worked with a lot of companies that are in the healthcare space, and something that they're trying to do in addition to engage consumers, engaging providers. And so one of the ways that they often leverage press, and one of the ways that they've used me in the past, has been to create press that engages the providers and helps them to feel connected to what they're doing in the product. And that's a great use of yourself, and that's a great use of your advisors and so forth, is to look at companies that you're interested in partnering with and offering yourself to them for press, to write a blog post for them, or to be on their podcast, and doing the same for them. Because as you've all experienced, once you have once you feel like you've contributed to something, once you feel like you understand the person behind that, you feel a real loyalty to them, and you feel a real commitment to what it is that they're building. And so that's a purpose that press can serve as well. So it's not talking to consumers, it's not talking to investors, it's talking to the people that you're building your business with, and helping them in their journey, and creating a stronger, deeper collaboration. So those are sort of 3 buckets to think about with press, and 3 ways then to sort of approach the press. And with all of them, you don't have to reach for the stars. You can definitely start small, be it with a small role in a big publication, or a big role in a small publication that reaches a very, very targeted audience. And both of those approaches will make this a lot easier, and make this something that you can ad hoc yourself, and you don't need to engage a publicity firm to do. That said, publicity firms are great, and there can be a time and a place for that, and it can take a lot off your plate, but there's a lot that you can do, particularly now where there's so many outlets, there's so many communities where people are talking to each other. There's a lot that you can find on your own.
This is extremely, extremely informative. Thank you so much for breaking this out. And you covered different areas of how one can approach it, and a very strategic why one would approach a certain area, and a bit of background information. Still speaking about like that moonshot of like, let's just say, just covering that out of the gate, but like I like XYZ, I want to be in this big publication. Like it might be helpful also knowing like, what does it actually take? If one wanted to go for that option, like what is realistic, what's unrealistic, what would be the steps, how does one build relationships, how does one find those publications? Can you walk us through that process?
Well, so I mean, the clearest path is, to be honest, to get a great publicity firm. And sometimes, like, I've worked with a lot of big companies, and sometimes you have to go through a lot of firms. Like every company I've worked with, like their dream is to be in the New York Times, right? And sometimes we've had to go through 3 PR agencies before we, even get close to that. And then, also sometimes the piece that winds up being in the New York Times isn't the piece that's wanted, because that's the other thing, is that the larger the publication you're shooting for, the less control you have over the editorial process, because the story that they're writing is, they have a lot of power in those stories. That said, the New York Times story is always very valuable, and if you get in, like, it's a great thing. But the surest thing is really to engage outside PR. And now what's lovely is that you can do that with people who are doing flex time too. We have a lot of members of Dreamers and Doers who have started companies that engage part-time flex work, publicists who used to work for major agencies who can do sort of a one-off project. And so that's kind of a budgeted way to do that. The other component of it, because people have been able to do this stuff on their own, is to really have a strong pitch. And so maybe this is a moment that we can go into what that looks like. And, pitching you can have the most interesting company in the world, and you still need to pitch a story around it. And I think that that's where, sometimes all of us, myself included, when we work for a company, we get so excited about that we're doing, is we forget sort of the context. Is there like is there a cultural moment around this? Is there like such a compelling founder story around this? Like, how does this story impact the reader? Where does the story fit into what's going on in society right now? So that's a really good way of thinking about what you're doing. And whether it's a founder story where something really interesting happened to you. Like I think that you've all probably, if you've used ZocDoc or similar services, there's a story about how Cyrus, the founder, had a toothache, and that's an interesting story. Like, okay, and so then he had this idea after that, and then where did it go, and how that's a hook, right? And likewise, if you start, say, I don't know, there's all these CBD companies out there, there's CBD is having a moment. And so, that's an easy product to pitch because it goes into a round. If there's a cultural moment around CBD, how is your product fitting into this landscape of CBD companies? And so those are two ways of sort of thinking about pitching. Is number one, your founder story, how that works, what's interesting about that, what's incredibly unique about that, or, how does your product fit into or your company or your idea fit into the ecosystem of ideas and cultural moments that we're having right now. And the key is, when you've hit something, when it feels like something you haven't heard before. I think that sometimes it's easy, and I've seen this from really like smart people. They'll look, when they're looking for journalists to pitch to, they'll see, oh, so-and-so wrote this article about CBD, about this company that's a lot like my company. I'm going to pitch that person because they're clearly interested in that. And yes, that person is, interested in CBD, but because they've written a story about a company that's a lot like your company, they're actually going to be less interested in writing about your company unless you can differentiate your company, unless you can prove that your company is moving the needle one step further, or unless you're saying, we're taking a totally different approach, and here's why this is interesting and unique. Because ultimately, editors and journalists, they're really looking to get readership, and particularly now where all these like clicks and reads and shares are being measured, they're trying to find something that is incredibly new and sort of sparks this like, whoa, I've never seen that before. I have to share this immediately. Another point, and I'm running all around, so I'm hoping that these things sort of knit together somewhat, is that it's different pitching writers and editors. Editors are much more interested in companies themselves because they're already employed. They can sit back. They have a lot of power in terms of deciding what goes in the mix. Writers, on the other hand, have to pitch their stories. And so just like you have to make your pitch really exciting to them, they have to make their pitch really exciting to their editor. And so it's much harder to just write to a writer and say, hi, I have let's move away from CBD. I have a new packaged water company that doesn't use plastic. A writer could be like, oh, that's great. But, what's the hook? What's the storyline? Is there, some, develop, some place that you're sourcing it, and is there adventure story there or something like that? Whereas an editor can be like, oh, we can just toss that into, XYZ roundup that we already have going. And so editors are easier to pitch very simple stories versus writers who want something that's like complex and has like a narrative. And I think that sort of a final point on all of this is, okay, how do you make contact with these people? When I started as a freelance journalist, I cold pitched. Like I got to a point where, my career was very lazy and people were assigning me a lot of articles. But in the very beginning, my first several cover stories were editors who had never heard of me, whose emails I found through my networks, and just worked really, really, really hard on pitches. And what's nice now is that I think that the line between who a writer is and who a brand is and who a company is a little bit more obscured. And so you can pitch your company story as an essay that you want to write about how you got there, or, an essay that you want to write about something that you saw or experienced in working with your company. And that gets your company just as much exposure as just the sort of stories that are that. And so you can think about yourself when you pitch, especially if you're doing this solo, as your own writer. And how would you tell your story in a way that is like really interesting, really compelling, has that sort of like, aha moment, I've never seen this before, gives people something that they can. I always think when I talk about stories that are good, it's like, what will somebody take to the cocktail party on Friday and tell all of their friends? Like if you heard this, what would be like that moment where it's like, oh, this is great, canapé conversation or whatnot. Like that's a good filter for thinking about if you've hit it in terms of how interesting your pitch is.
It's really, really cool. On that, we actually had a few follow-up questions that were submitted on pitching. One is, how does the timeline generally look like between pitching, getting published, and just getting a rough sense as you go into that process, as well as how do you foster deep, authentic connections, especially if you're trying to form long-term relationships with journalists?
Perfect timeline. And this is where I may be a little bit, when I was a magazine journalist, we had long lead times. Like you could pitch us, you would have to pitch us a Christmas story in like June. It's sped up considerably since then, but because with publications, particularly if it's a glossy publication, of which there are fewer and fewer I know, they still have fairly long lead times. They're tied to the fashion calendar still and so forth. So the stories tend to get worked on for longer. They sometimes get bumped around because of the mix. This can actually be a really good thing because they end up being very high quality. You'll have like great photographers working on it. One of the sort of dirty little secrets is the wrong word. One of the awesome little secrets about glossy magazines and glossy women's magazines is they are some of the most meticulously researched and fact-checked publications, and the pieces that go in there are quite perfect as a result. And so you get a really nice piece of copy out of that. Obviously, blog stuff tends to be very much like this. The writer gets an email from their editor sometimes the day of and says, you know, by this evening, we want to hit this news cycle with something. So we want something right away. So in terms of building relationships with editors and with writers, being available and being prompt and being super easy to work with is huge. I can't tell you, and this is so many friends of mine who are freelancers have said the same thing. Like editors, writers, you know, anybody likes working with sources, and editors like working with writers who are on the ball and easy and organized and paying attention. So, you know, checking your email, making sure if somebody needs something from you that you provide it within, you know, 24-hour period or something very quickly. And, you know, and just kind of try to anticipate what they might need, you know, not to the point where you're emailing somebody and, you know, constantly and doing things that create more work for them. But, you know, when you submit, you know, if you need to submit information, you know, submit, you know, any kind of background information that might be helpful, that kind of thing, giving them the content they need in a prompt fashion and in a fairly easy way, it goes a long, long way. And there's something else I wanted to say about that. Oh, right. Editors and writers are also, we're like everyone else, we're lazy sometimes because we're doing so many other things. And so if you can nail it on one story, your writer, the writer who worked with you, the editor who worked with you will come back to you. And so that is it's you know, kind of this unfortunate chicken and egg thing where, you know, to build a relationship, you need to have a relationship, but it's something that can feel very exciting once you meet an editor. You know, think about it as a long-term relationship, because if you were a good expert for them once, they are going to come back to you time and time again. And if they have a colleague who's working in a story, they're going to recommend you. So those relationships are valuable, and invest in them. In terms of how to find those people beyond just cold emailing them as well, you know, your social networks. I think that we're at that stage where there's so much cross-pollination, and we have so many groups. I feel like I can't say enough about Dreamers and Doers on this. And this is not a plug. This is just something I've seen when I was a journalist, back when Geisha had Dreamers and Doers as a free and open group. And even with the Jobs and Gigs, I have gone on and looked for people there. And so there is, if you sort of start poking around in the wild, you're going to find writers. We have a lot of lists of writers, and, you know, and then just get around to meeting them, pitch them something that you feel is really relevant to who they are and what they do. Research them as well, look at their background and see the breadth of things that they've written about and the way that they've written about it, and try to tailor your pitch to them that way.
Thank you so much. So anyone who has questions, I'll ask one or two more, and then I'll go over to your questions. So you can use the chat to kind of mention it if you have a question, and I'll put the spotlight on you. So you can start doing that. So we covered a lot of editors and writers covering you in articles. How about you becoming a contributor? How would you go about that process to make sure it's strategic in terms of for your company or personal brand? And what should you keep in mind there that might be different in terms of pitching yourself and reaping the most benefits?
I think so. You're talking about if you were someone wanting to write not so much about their company, but write about ideas, sort of starting to pitch yourself as a writer on a certain topic.
Or for example, be a contributor for Forbes. Sara has been helping us with going through the Forbes pitches and making sure that they increasing the chances of them actually being accepted. So how, like in terms of what would one keep in mind as one pitches oneself for that? something
It's a
like
very similar process in terms of like everything we've said so far. And then actually you're absolutely right. There's more stuff that goes into it in the sense that like you really want to sell yourself. And so always when I was, it's in fact quite similar to pitching yourself as a writer for a project, what you would do for an editor, which is basically lead with your idea and, make it, think about it, again, think about what's timely, think about what's being talked about, and if there's a way to push that conversation further. You can't write about something that people have seen. You have to write about something, some additional layer, some additional step, or ideally some new discovery that you've made. And so think about lead with a strong pitch, but then also pitch yourself afterwards and include a bio. I think a LinkedIn link is really good. Any links to anything that you've written before so that people can see what your writing style is. And so, more begets more, right? And that's a good reason to, perhaps start if you're, wanting to hit a bigger publication, write for free for a couple smaller publications for a little bit. You don't need more than 2 or 3 articles, but if you have 2 or 3 clips that you're really happy with that you can share along with your short bio and a LinkedIn profile and a pitch, that's going to look very, very good to any writer or editor. And then when you're pitching yourself, obviously, look for stories that really, where the editor can very easily, or the writer can very easily see the connection between your background and the topic. And perhaps also, highlight a little bit of that. And as you pitch too, and I guess this is a slight difference when you're pitching an idea versus, your company itself, is you can talk a little bit about, with the company, you can tease a little bit about the company. With an idea, you can either tease some of the, aha moments that you're hoping to reveal in the article that you write, something that the editor may not have seen before, or the process. Here are the people that I want to talk to. I have this connection at XYZ company, and I have this connection. I want to interview people who are doing this and have achieved this result, and here are the types of people, or here are the exact people that I'd like to talk to, and here's why. So that's some specificity. I mean, you don't want your pitches to be generally longer than a paragraph, but you want that paragraph to be very skimmable and sharp and specific with some details that hook people, something that makes someone say, oh, I want to read this more. What happens next? Think about it as like a Netflix teaser or whatever, what is going to make you want to watch this movie, and watch this movie right now, and then watch the next movie and the next movie.
Super good, super helpful. So we have a few questions submitted. I'll start being the one conveying two, because they are shorter, and then I'll actually put the spotlight after that on Lauren to ask hers, because she might need to add some background information. So Nina Hans, who I believe is signing in from Hawaii, is asking, are official press releases still a good idea? And what's a good example of a good press release submission process?
This actually came up in the fall with a client who had just done a $50 million raise, and they were adamant about not having a press release because they thought they were passé. And so I actually ended up in a lot of conversations with their PR agency. It was a great agency, really, really established. And the short answer is press releases are still great. You don't want to overdo it. You want a press release when you have press. And not, I've worked with companies that have done press releases around everything, and then you create press release fatigue and nobody reads your press releases anymore. But if you have actual news, it's a really, really good way to give someone cliff notes on what that news is. And especially if someone actually winds up writing about you, they have a reference point that has all of the information as you want it. And that, I think that's the other part of the power of it, is that it tells your story the way that you want it told, and frames it that way, and then backs it up with any data and numbers that you have that you want to get out there. And so when somebody's reporting on you, the fact that they have that, and they don't have to go searching for other information, means that the likelihood that the story gets told in a way that is satisfactory to you increases. So yeah, if you have a good piece of news, and if you have good distribution for a press release, it's definitely worthwhile. There's ways to go without it. I mean, I know that if you don't have outside PR, and if you're bootstrapping, there's this pressure to feel like you have to pay for all these agencies then to release your press release into the wild. And I think that if you're in that space, there's just know that you don't have to have a press release either. But if you have the means for it, it's definitely useful.
And there's actually a follow-up question on this. So I'll go to that first from actually Marie. So she's asking, so she's about to launch her product, which is a marketing software, in June, and is planning on 2 to 3 press releases and suggestions on PR agency versus trying it yourself.
Yeah, and so I think you just answered it, but Could you give a sense of like costs for, let's say the smaller PR agencies, and then maybe the bigger ones, so that I get a sense for potential costs, or if I go and decide to try it myself first?
I don't always see those numbers because of how I work. Like, they don't want to show, the companies don't want to show people what they pay me either. But what I can say is that it's kind of a wild west right now, and that makes it really hard, right? Because, it's the same with the sort of work that I've done in the past. Like, there are agencies that will charge you like $10,000-$20,000 a month, right? And then there are people who are, grad students and doing this on the side, and they will charge you just a few $100s. And so some of it is like, you have to think about, I think that the best thing is to start from your budget. And then, and this is incredibly possible now because there are so many people who do flex work. And sometimes, particularly if you're just starting out and you're small, you don't need a lot of work. You just need someone who's been there to teach you how to do it yourself. And, particularly, a lot of these, the Upside is a great one. There's a number of different organizations out there where you can sort of shop around for people who are, perhaps like looking for a little bit of part-time engagement, but who have worked for big companies and with big companies in the past, and are willing to, do a small engagement where they show you the ropes, show you how to do it yourself. And that can be, anywhere. What I would suggest paying for something like that is something under $5,000 for a one-time deal. But with all of these things, like, you really start with what your budget is, and then work out from there. Kind of, start with what your budget is and what your priorities are, and then, start taking pitches and see, and then match yourself to the person who feels right to you in terms of their experience and their knowledge. And they're going, most people will cost a little bit more, and then you can bring their cost down a little bit by doing a limited engagement with you. I don't know if I said that entirely clearly, but basically, like, the costs are all over the place, and, there isn't going to be one sort of set grid that you can look at for that. But there's ways to get around even someone who looks very expensive that you might want to use by creating, deciding what your priorities are and engaging them just for that.
Amazing. And that's a great segue actually to Lauren. Lauren had a question that and Heidi as well had have her kind of dig into. Wait, to unmute you. Okay.
We can't hear you quite yet. So maybe here.
The unmute button. Maybe we're unmuting at the same time.
There we go. Is that better?
There we go. We got you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sara. This is amazing. I have a question about, it's pretty industry specific, but might be helpful to other people on the call. I have an equestrian marketplace. It's kind of like Nordstrom Rack meets The RealReal. And I've been approached by an industry publication, obviously super niche audience, but directly my audience. And they've approached me to do paid press. And there are multiple options in the packages that they've described to me. One's like a 3-page editorial, opportunity to be on their podcast, as well as some social media. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on paid publicity and when it might be a great time to do that, and maybe some pitfalls that I should potentially avoid.
It works. It works because that's a revenue stream for them. And so it's to their advantage to, make people have happy customers so that they get more customers. And that's something to think about also with organic press, is that you're contributing, you're competing against paid press a lot of the time, and that paid press is going to sometimes be favored. Again, in terms of like the right time to do it, it really has to do with like your budget. The drum that I want to keep beating is that, like, you can bootstrap everything, and people have, and people, do, and it's just a little bit more work. And, sometimes the results are, a little bit less known. But that said, I've seen companies who engage huge agencies and don't get much more result than, what happens when suddenly, like, we decide, on the back end that we're just going to email someone, and that ends up being what works. So, look at your budget. In your case, like, I just kind of have a gut feeling thinking that it could be something that's good, because you're a perfect example of what I talked about earlier, where you have a very, very, I was an equestrian when I was growing up, actually, so I know, like, I wish we had something like, but it's very niche. Like, there's a very particular group of people, and they're reading a very particular set of publications. And so to get in that publication is going to be extremely valuable to you, because it's all, like, in the New York Times, maybe 2% of everyone rides horses, but in what you're talking about, everyone does, and everyone is in the market for your gear. And so for your question, I would say this is a lot higher value than it is for someone who is talking to a generalist publication, for example. So I would say if you have the budget, it seems like something you should possibly do.
Awesome, thank you.
Can I ask a follow-on question? Is it okay?
Yeah.
So I'm in a similar situation. It's not quite as niche, but we basically sell software to address bias, discrimination, and harassment in the workplace. And so we sell to HR, and there's a publication called CIO Applications, and they are trying to sell us a reprint package, but it includes similar things to what Lauren was saying. The interesting thing, though, is that if you Google CIO applications, everyone largely thinks it's a scam. Everyone talks about how they know it's paid, and you're in this like top 25 list, but you paid to be on it, and like the certificate is bullshit. And so anyway, I just am curious around, like, does the advice still apply if it seems like when you Google it, people think it's baloney?
I mean, this is, again, and I want to qualify this. This is like totally my gut feeling that I'm answering on. It probably still works. Think about it. This was actually a good friend of mine. I don't know if you remember this in the news, but those, God, what are those awards that are in all the restaurant windows where they get like a wine spectator award? And then some guy who happens to be a good friend of mine, like, debunked that. He created a fake restaurant and a fake wine list and applied for it, and he got it. And you know what? We all know that. So many of us read that story, but you know what? We still like respond to that little sign in the window, right? And so if nothing else, it means that you're legitimate enough to make the effort to try to get these certifications. And so that's the way to think about it. Again, I think that and I can say on a consumer end, when I'm Googling something, even when, I assume that it's sponsored, like, I Google baby gear all day long these days. And like, I still sometimes will wind up buying that product because it's just the one that pops up on Amazon first, like the sponsored ad on Amazon. I'll purchase, even if I know that the only reason it's right there in front of me is because someone paid for it to be. So just thinking about consumer behavior that way, I would say probably there is still a value to it.
So I'm going to actually hop on to a few questions that are more general, and then I will hop on to a few questions that are very specific but still likely very relevant for many of you. So starting out actually with Rebecca, who had questions about hiring a publicist.
Yeah, you kind of already answered it. Hi, everybody. I think you kind of already answered it in terms of budget. Can you talk about, during a relationship with a publicist, how to know whether they're doing a good job other than like outcomes?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, yeah, and it's hard because sometimes, especially if you have a high bar for outcomes, like there's only so much that the publicist can control, I mean, if you happen to be in a cycle where, there's, like, say if you'd hired a publicist in November of 2016, like, nothing the publicist could have done would have gotten Donald Trump out of the news for you. I mean, it was just that. So thank you for asking the question that way, because I think you have already just an intuitive, nice sensitivity to the person's job. Yeah. But, I think it's a gut thing. I mean, obviously, if you come together and state the goals and, and that's from the get-go, I think a good way to know if you have a good publicist is if they're realistic. They say, okay, we know that you want this, but this is going to be hard. Here's what we are very confident we can deliver, and here's how we're going to do it. And so, the more open they are about their approach from the outset, the more you're in a good relationship from the beginning. And then to know if the relationship is ongoing, continuing to be good, it's really how the communication goes. Like if you feel like you're understanding, if they're making clear their approach and their thought process and why they're doing something one way, how they're assessing when something didn't work out, when they pitched something and they got a no, what they're doing with that no. If they're saying, okay, here's why we think we got the no, here's what we want to do instead, here's a new approach. So it's not so much like, okay, this didn't work and so therefore they're bad. It's if this didn't work and they didn't do anything else, then they're probably not good for you. But if this didn't work and they used it as a learning moment, as we say, like, to do something else and do something else that seems sort of more on target and starts a process of effectiveness, then you know that you were someone good.
That's great. Thank you.
Then actually Kimberly, who had some questions about great examples for pitches, but I'll have her kind of chime in.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I was just wondering, as you were talking about these sort of like how to write a really good pitch statement and all of that, if you potentially maybe like after this call had some examples of some like really great pitch statements that have like worked super well. I feel like that would be just helpful to sort of like see those in action and what it really looks like and what that sort of like paragraph is like.
Funny you should ask. Geisha and I've been talking about that a lot because we want to, for the Forbes column and sort of ongoing ones, we want to be able to offer you guys some of that support. So we are actually putting together a document of some dreamers and doers pitch statements that we've seen that that have been successful and have gotten them the gigs that they've been looking for. And I can also separately go through and see if I can find some things that I've found to be really high quality that I can share for sure. And you should, on that note, again, like I'm a resource for you guys ongoing. So, this call is not the end of this conversation with any of you. Like, how to find me. And I'm super, super happy to help you think through some of this stuff and to look over things that you're working on. It doesn't take me that long. And I feel
Thank you, Sara. So we'll also definitely send a follow-up email on that and include maybe some examples there already. Then on to Sarah in Boston. Her video doesn't work, but she had a question around books, which I know a lot of you are writing. So Sara, do you want to dive in?
Hi, Sara. First of all, I just want to say this is fabulous, and I really appreciate how smart and insightful and on point and just hitting it on all levels this is. This has been so valuable, so thank you so much. So yeah, a question for me as an author. So my first book came out 5.5 years ago, and I was actually able to get some really great press and a balance, as you said, between a small mention in a large publication like Shape magazine, and a big mention in smaller publications. So it's been really great. And I was able to do that as sort of positioning myself as an expert source on both yoga, as I'm a national yoga teacher, and also sort of using yoga as a tool for career change and transition. For my next book, I'm totally jumping ship, which is unadvisable considering that I've spent so much time and energy building this expertise up. But I'm jumping ship and I'm writing a true crime of an unsolved murder.
Oh, wow.
That takes place in New York, actually. So I'm wondering how I'm feeling totally overwhelmed and unsure about how to get press on that and to switch lanes from what I've already done.
So first of all, do you have an agent and a publisher, or are you self-publishing?
So I self-published my first book and it worked really, really
Amazing.
well.
Yeah.
So I'm just deciding whether I want to do that again because I did have such a great experience, or whether I want to try traditional. At this point, honestly, I'm leaning toward independent and doing it again just because I did have such a great experience.
Yeah, something that I'll say is that one of my two things. First of all, traditional publishing PR is notoriously terrible, like really, really bad, unless you're a book that they're putting everything behind. Exactly. And that gets determined very early on. And if you're not a book that that they care about, you basically have to bootstrap your PR anyway. So that's kind of a known. And now with budget cuts and, just publishing is having so much trouble, like even the good people are bootstrapping their PR. Like I know so many authors and they're really like looking at their books as, this self-made project, even when they have, they have the right agent, they have the right everything. So I don't know that I think you're thinking about this in the right way. The other sort of case study I can point to is one of my very best friends is a very successful author, Camille No Pagan. I don't know if you guys have read any of her books, but she's like, has a number of bestsellers and ended up jumping over to Amazon, which has kind of a hybrid model of self-publishing and sort of supporting you in the publishing process. And that ended up being a very successful way for her to go. And so I'm seeing people, I guess what I'm saying is I'm seeing people move from traditional to doing it on your own. And I mean, there is a little bit more legwork in the creative process, but since you've done that side of things before, the PR machine, I don't think you're gaining a lot by going with a traditional publishing house. So it sounds like you're thinking about things correctly.
Thank you. So do you have any ideas on how I can position, like what kind of press can I get if I'm not doing this, sort of self-help, sort of expert source sort of thing? Yeah. I mean, that's where it gets a little bit hard. I mean, I think that's where we probably have to lean into like the thought leadership stuff, because, what press would there be? It would be, okay, if your book is, if sales are good, there's going to be a lot of people reading and reviewing your book, or if the buzz is. But I guess this is a little bit beyond, but this is something I can look into is, if you self-publish, how it works with Circus Reviews and Publishers Weekly, if there's a way to submit to them for them to review, because those reviews are then sort of what ends up driving a lot of the magazine and newspaper press and blog press that you get, where people review your books closer to the date of publication. So that would be one thing to think about. And then another thing to think about that I know a lot of people do is, there's a lot of, the Goodreads thing and a lot of like women's reading groups. I feel like there are now groups that sign up to be early readers, and, and then they will review something on Amazon and drive sales that way. This is a question that if you email me afterwards, I have 1,000,001 contacts in book publishing, and like a ton of my friends have written books or have worked in publishing, marketing, and so forth. So I can get current information on sort of what the pathway would be. Because I think that as I've been talking, so in case you haven't noticed, I'm thinking aloud as I'm talking. I think that there are a couple of steps that you want to preemptively take, involving finding early readers who can enthuse about your book and review it and blog about it. And then also seeing if some of these like early review sites, how they work with self-publishing. And so that will be something that will then set you up for working on press a little bit better later. So definitely send me an email later, and I can just shoot you some links to some resources, and ideally make an introduction to someone who can talk to you more about that. Thank you. That would be awesome. And I actually can answer two of that, which is that Publishers Weekly and Kirkus do review independently published books, which they did review mine. And I was very lucky to get a great review, which I then was able to parlay into those placements. I guess I was thinking more about like positioning myself. Like if you write nonfiction, you can talk about the topic of your book and use that to, as you said, add value to the reader. But if you're writing in a way that's not nonfiction, that's not that self-help, and I don't like that term, but I'm going to say just nonfiction, where you have the easy, obvious way to say, okay, this is what my book is about, and here's a snippet for you, reader. How do you, I guess I'm just trying to figure out how to position myself as more of a novelist, where you don't have that easy, obvious, well, not easy, but easier way to present value to the reader.
Here's the question. So this is, you said it was true crime, right? So it's, there was an initial story, like an event that happened that has inspired this, right?
Yeah, it's totally true. It's 100% true. It is technically nonfiction, but because there isn't that easy, like, this is how to make your life better, or this is how you change your careers, which was my first topic.
No, this is great though, because basically what this means is that you get to position yourself as a journalist, and you have this like great crime story that you've uncovered. And I mean, I would recommend, just off the top of my head, this sounds like something that Daily Beast would love. And so you wrote this book, and you can then you can pitch an article about the topic, like how you discovered it and so forth. And I feel like they would eat it up, and the Daily Beast has a really good, you can replicate that with a bunch of different publications. That's one that I would definitely target. So, I think that the way that you start to see yourself and the way that you start to see your book is think of yourself as a reporter. Like, you are a crime reporter now. I mean, you're reporting a crime story, and that story happens to be so awesome that you're turning it into a book. But this is now kind of your work and your beat. And so pitch your story that way. You can pitch versions of it as, and especially as you're doing the research and as you're doing the writing, there's going to be a lot of stuff that you're not going to want to put in your book that is probably going to make for a good magazine article or a good post on a well-read news blog or something like that. And so save all of those, like just have a file where you keep all of those, and then turn those into pitches and sort of build so you're kind of almost building the larger background story as you're writing your book. And it'll probably, interestingly, like writing some of those articles will inform how you write your book. And so you can start like long before you even finish the book, I think, to do this. But I think that the key to this is just to start to think of yourself as a journalist, because that's what you're doing with this book. And so then pitch accordingly, like pitch stories surrounding this topic as a journalist would, thinking of yourself as a journalist. And I really think that you'll get a good response from, because people, I am now extremely curious about what this crime story is, and I would love to ask you more about it later.
Same here, and thank you both. I just want to make sure we get 2 more really quick questions.
Thank you so much. That was amazing.
And thank you for this like huge breadth of knowledge. It's really, really inspiring. So actually on to Alida, who herself, interestingly, has spent a ton of time like at Refinery 29, at The Points Guy, in that space. And she had one question on the topic as well.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm starting up a retreat business for surf and meditation, and was trying to think about clever ways to get press, and was thinking, well, maybe if I did a giveaway where I pitch out to publications to say, I'll give away a free slot to one of your readers or whatever. But I was wondering if that is kind of looked down upon, or how that usually works, or is there another line in? I know sometimes there are different people who are designated for partnership kind of opportunities like that. So perhaps there's a different channel I would go through, but I'm just curious if you have any experience or thoughts about that.
So just to be sure that I understand the question, so your business is you're starting these retreats, and the retreats are going to be ongoing, and so you want to get publication. So what I would say is, I would offer a press slot to someone at a publication that is really aligned, again, with your readership, something that the people who are going to be going on these retreats will be reading. And it's only frowned upon if you want to write for the New York Times. And not even that, it's only frowned upon if you want to write for the New York Times travel section. Like, I can never write for the New York Times travel section because I have taken a press trip. And when I wrote for the New York Times, I had to fill in a huge form and say that I had taken a press trip, and therefore I was ineligible to ever be a travel writer for them. That said, wow. A lot of people lie. I know a lot of people who have taken press trips have also written, but unless it's a journalist who's specifically writing for the Times travel section or targeting that, anyone can take a press trip, and journalists really like to do it because they don't make a lot of money. So this is often the way that they can travel. Something else I would suggest to you is, I have a good friend who has a company called Allswell, ALLSWELL, and it's not the mattress company. They have both, unfortunately, have the same name, but she is in a very similar space. She does writing retreats, and I would look at her Instagram and and if you can't find it all, contact me later, because she was a publicist before she did this, and she's done some really smart things in terms of getting press for herself and press for her retreats, and it's really started to take off. So sometimes also, this is just something for everyone, find someone you want to emulate and look how they got their press. If there's a company you really like, if there's a person you really like, look at what they're doing, and often you can just sort of crib off of what they're doing and do something very similar.
So, but would they, of course they're going to want to say yes, but to your point, if they're just a writer, the editor might say, of course you want that free trip, but what's the story there, right? So you'd still have to combine it with a compelling narrative.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And you would want for the press trip, for sure, to have a guarantee. And you can do this for a lot of press trips. In order for the writer to be able to take it, or the editor to be able to take it, there has to be commitment to write a story.
Okay. Yeah.
It's an unspoken, sometimes there isn't. Like, often I was like a last minute invite to press trips because like I was good in groups. And so if like the publicist was like, we have a slot. But generally, it is very, very normal to say you need to write a story in order to come on this trip.
Got it. Thank you.
Amazing. So the last question, I'm actually going to take the liberty and make it a bit more focused. Liz had originally asked about just like general broad tips on what else one can do to get press. So I'm going to narrow it down. And she also asked about blogging. Like, a lot of us think about blogging or are blogging on our personal websites, you've worked with a lot of companies on content strategy and they have their company blogs. Do you just have a few pro tips on the blogging route, especially if you're generating your own content and hosting it kind of on your website?
Pro tips on blogging. I think that a couple things, and I know we have limited time, but, you don't have to write a novel. You can do it in bullet points. Everyone's a skimmer now. And so, especially if it feels intimidating to carve out the time to do it, you don't have to write long things. In fact, some longtime bloggers that I know who do it, sort of for business value, I see their posts, they're very short these days. Another good time saver and a really good biz dev strategy is to have guest bloggers or to make your blogs interviews of people, because there again, if writing feels like overwhelming and, oh my God, where am I going to find the time? Doing a Q&A with somebody who's inspiring, not only is it going to align that person with your brand and get that person excited about your brand and have that person then in a position where they're excited about the piece of content and they'll share your brand on social media because they want to share their blog post, but it's a good time-saving tool for you and can sort of create some really interesting content and color there. So, bringing in other people and then just realizing that you don't have to write a novel and also that you don't have to keep up a cadence. It's not good if you write a blog post and then wait 6 months and then write another blog post, but you don't need to. The only person who's sticking to your schedule is you. And so just because you've been posting once a week, if there's a week where you're too busy, no one is going to notice. So it's okay. And so just to take a little bit of that pressure off. And I think just as a closing remark on all of this, that is my one statement on press just in general, is that make it something that is positive and has a positive impact for you and not stressful, because it doesn't work the same way for any two people, any two companies. And your gut, just like everything else, your gut is probably going to be best on this. And there are a million different routes you can take. And just because you're not getting your name in flashy lights doesn't mean that, some of these other strategies won't be just as effective for you and vice versa. So, and it takes time, you don't have to do everything overnight. Some of this is a slow burn and it will happen. I mean, the great thing now is that there's so many outlets and there's so many opportunities and there's so many approaches. And so you will hit one that works for you and works for you well and is sustainable. And that's what you're ultimately looking for.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So good. We are going to close this call out in a second. Just a quick heads up. Do not hop off if you want to join. Just a few more minutes for introductions. But now closing out this call, this was incredibly insightful. I learned so much. And thank you for sharing your knowledge and all of you for chipping in with the questions. It was amazing spending this incredibly informative hour with you all. Thank you. This was wonderful. And then just stop.